so much for joining me as we talk about CLM and how it fits into lead to cash.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to see you. And yeah, I would like to just give a brief background on myself. I'm excited about being part of NeuraFlash's webinar. And then, like you said, lead the cash, Salesforce ecosystem, and CLM. So high level, my background, been in software sales in some form or fashion for, a decade plus. Really the companies that I've kind of attached to are ones that are solving for that kind of last frontier, if you will, digitization. So whether it was data privacy, where I kind of met legal technology, the mortgage industry through a disruptive company in the Bay Area. And then I found CLM upon my move to Seattle some years ago and been in the ecosystem ever since. So I really like it. Right now, I'm currently a customer success manager at DocuSign, and you're one of our key strategic partners.
That was a great overview. I love knowing the history of how people find CLM. And I think a lot of people find it and then fall in love with what it can do. I was a similar story. I've been doing agreements overall for about a decade. I started with agreements between property managers, the government, and people that have misrepresented their income, which is such a strange place to find agreements. But then over time, that evolved into workflow, which evolved into document management, which brought me to the Spring CM ecosystem, and then into the same CLM as a whole industry of what we talk about. And then now here at Neuroflash, I lead the DocuSign practice, and that sits inside a lead to cash. So a lot of what we'll talk about today is very sales minded, but we know that it's so much more than that, and it's all over the place. I guess one thing to get started in is, do you want to define CLM for anyone that's not familiar?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, during the course of this dialogue, I'm excited to talk about anecdotally, like what we've seen too. Like you mentioned, you came from the space, like the digitization as well. And I was a former seller. Maybe the audience would like to know that. So I can speak to experience. And then even as customer success, now I'm part of a greater account team and, how can we use CLM? So yeah, to answer your question, CLM, I think a lot of people don't realize that it's not just a a software category. It's really a process. So you see a lot of people that have been in quote unquote CLM really stemming probably from the 90s, early 2000s. So it's literally contract lifecycle management if you want to break it. And so even prior to any software that's being applied, is where that contract is in the life cycle, whether it's with the salesperson negotiating terms, whether it's the legal, looking at clauses and, in terms of liability, what they can offer to that salesperson. Procurement, as we know, we love the buy side, HR, finance. I mean, it's a holistic view of contracts. And then, prior to software, it was really a manual process, as we know, and we can probably get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. It is all of the pieces of it. And it's so interesting when it's its own thing, kind of on its own, of what is the legal process behind this and how can that help everyone in your business? And then also, who specifically do we want to start with? And so I guess on that note, let's talk through who our target audience is, not necessarily for this conversation, but for CLM. I know with NeuraFlash, so much of what we do is tied to Salesforce and BQ, Sales Cloud, Marketing Cloud, Billing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's changed who I speak to the most about CLM. And now I think it's so much so the sales cycle of how can I support the outward motion of what you are signing versus the inside motion, which is the Salesforce side or the internal IT system.
Absolutely. I think the conversation has changed. I mean, I've been around this space 5+ years or so, and I think before CLM had its roots in maybe matter management, as we know, or e-discovery. So it was maniacally focused on the legal audience. And that's not our own motion, as we know, because legal, tend to own quote unquote legal tech or legal ops stack. But what you've seen is kind of this maturation of CLM where, salespeople are getting excited about it, integrates with their systems. I think that will go into whether it's Salesforce, procurement likes it because, not a focus of this dialogue, but into ERP. And as a former seller, at the end of the day, whether it's NeuraFlash or DocuSign, our focus is to get not only serve our existing clients, but also bring in new business. And so whether we're public or private, how can we bring that money in quicker and then reduce friction in the sales cycle? And I think that's really where CLM has been embraced by sales folks in partnership with the legal, in partnership with the IT and sales ops that are supporting them.
Absolutely. We have, this is not an ad for this, but we have an offering called like Revenue Rescue. And I love
Mhm.
it because it's like, how do you get money in the door faster, especially in the middle of a recession?
Yep.
And I love it because it's always the natural lead up to like, well, how fast are your contracts getting signed? And can we do
Yep.
that faster? Like, it's great that your people are in the field, but how long are red lines taking that it's holding up money in the door? And how contracting is more than illegal. It's about revenue and it's about sales. Like their whole job is getting that signature, which is so funny. If you come back to it, like DocuSign or any e-signature tool is the bread and butter of how companies drive revenue.
Absolutely. And so often I see people on LinkedIn, in a quarter, they always say, and, shamelessly, I'd like to see the DocuSign, but the DocuSign is really what executes that last step, the e-sign component of it. But it really is, like you mentioned, the whole CLM, or, you're taking it back to the conversation between the client and the seller internally with the legal and the other stakeholders. So I'm excited to dive into it a little bit more in our conversation. And then, would love to give examples of when I was a seller without CLM, that dark world as well.
Let's get into it. So you do customer success and you did sales before. So what do you see are the pain points when people aren't quite ready for a CLM or before they make this transition into investing in this?
Yeah, I think some of the pain points, and I'm curious to hear your thought as a CLM practitioner at NeuraFlash. And a lot of times, as a former seller, software is just bestowed upon you, and I think that's actually unanimously, no matter what your role is, you're in an organization and they procure a software based on a rubric and RFP, but not all the time. Again, I wouldn't say all the time, but not all the time are the people using that end software at the end of the day consult, or maybe the right amount of people. And so, I think that change management is a big aspect of any software, especially sales. Having been a former seller, you want the least amount of friction in the tool stack that you're given, whether it's SFTC, whether it's like one's a plug into SFTC, like a CMM. And so I would say that change management is a huge aspect. Actually understanding the life and the day of a seller. I'll just give anecdotally, I was with the client last week and we literally walked in a workshop. They're about to go live, actually with the SFTC integration. And hey, let's talk through your key sellers. So they were AEs, AM, sales support, and then an ancillary team. And it really was it was just awakening on both sides that we need to be mindful of the change management now moving forward. And then the training of perpetuity, the why. I think the why, Nikita, is the biggest thing. Why did we procure it in the first place? And then can we attach some success metrics and KPIs to the why? And it can be iterative over time. So we are both a success in that endeavor.
Yeah, I love that. The outcomes and the why,
Yep.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think with the why, it's such a funny, delicate line of, especially with salespeople, is I know salespeople don't want to follow the rules. They want to just do their job. And so leaning into that of like, hey, I will automate, and I'm speaking as a practitioner. I've been sales before, but it's not my bread and butter. Today, when I'm talking to sales teams to get their buy-in, it's always a conversation of, if I do this for you, you get to just sell. Like you don't have to worry about uploading the right version or checking in the emails or sending it to the right contact or stacking your versions or all of that boring stuff that nobody wants to deal with. I can take
Yeah.
that off. So you are just raking in your commission because that's all you got to worry about. And I feel like that's the moment where people eyes light up of like, oh, so if I just listen to you for 30 more minutes, I don't ever have to do that again. And I think like IT, legal, everybody that's guarding that process
Yep.
wants that buy-in to happen of like, okay.
Mhm.
And then for their own investment, the outcomes on the other side. I love that NeuraFlash actually puts skin in the game when it comes to outcomes. We put the outcomes in our SOWs, and often even write the SOW so that you pay the full price if these outcomes are met. Like, we believe wholeheartedly in what this will bring you. But that's always like the thing IT and legal want, because they're like, hey, I invested money and I got this return on the other side. And that way everybody's kind of happy. The why and the why it's a success as well. Yeah.
I think that's great. I mean, to touch upon NeuraFlash, you're in a unique position where you're already a leader in the SFDC CRM category, which spans back 20 years now. And then you're bringing in this cornerstone of CLM. And so I think it's incredible that you've probably been doing it as a practitioner in CRM world for some time, but putting those outcomes in, and then let's measure again. And I think that any reasonable client too, you can't know everything about CLM upon the first outset or first phase or first implementation. And I would think that it would be iterative over time. Maybe a KPI, and we can get into it, maybe it's a turnaround time. But again, we mentioned red lines historically can be a lot longer cycle than maybe anticipated. So how do we trim that down? And maybe they thought there was going to be a 50% reduction, and maybe there's only a 25%, but it's still quicker revenue in the door. And so you iterate, you pivot.
Yeah. That's such a great point. And because you do customer success, for us, it's about the implementation. But for you, being at a product company, it's probably a different set of questions. For you, what do you find yourself asking the most to measure success?
And it's a great question. I think that we've probably seen business objectives from the outset of a project. They're probably not that indifferent from client to client, whether it's, mid-market to enterprise, but constantly you see, we want transparency, we want visibility, searchability, because I think you made the earlier point, Nikita, about in a recession, how do you mine those contracts? And so, all the things I said apply in a good or bad economic time. And so those are high level. What I like to do, even for any implementation, is validate, and then post go live. Is there something measurable that we can work together? Again, maybe it's one step below that high level objective of transparency, visibility, and searchability. For instance, maybe a seller says, gosh, and actually we had this anecdotally a few weeks ago where a seller said, we're pouring over a whole day to look at our contracts. In terms of, especially from account management perspective, the data is not very easily found in Salesforce oftentimes. And so how can you extract it through CLM? Maybe it's searches, as we know, reporting, and then also I would say AI too. And maybe we can touch upon AI. So I think those are the key things. Like, what can we measure? Can we trim down search time in terms of turnaround time? Maybe there was no way to measure oftentimes. We have customers with no baseline. So they know the process is broken, but they don't even have a baseline. So let's identify, like I mentioned, maybe we trim down, maybe we're ambitious at 50% time, but I always say within the first 90 to call it 120 days, that'll be somewhat of our baseline, given that the adoption is as we agree as well. So I think there's a lot of different things in terms of success metrics, but adoption, can we kind of identify together? It's not one-sided. Some KPIs that make sense, and that makes sense not only for maybe the first 90 days, but then pivot and then change them as we go into our relationship long-term between DocuSign and said client.
I really like that. I was taken aback. We recently completed a project that went very well as far as stars. But one of the outcomes that we talked through, we went around and around of like, if we don't know baseline, what are we going to measure? And Neuroflash really likes to put numbers behind our outcome, so it's not just something to say like, oh, it's easier to find it, right? So one thing that they, speaking with the CFO and the CEO, and they said, we can never get people to use our paper because we have such huge customers that set their rules, and we kind of just comply. And it's fine because we're very successful, but we're investing in this. And one thing that we really want is to measure how much third-party paper we're processing versus our paper, and see if there's things we can make better in our paper so that they're more likely to accept it. And I was like, I love that. Some of their clients are like Ford and Mercedes and like big companies that are not going to change, but maybe we can like pivot and pivot and pivot and take a lot of 1-degree turns to get to a place where our paper is acceptable. And I love that because we can measure that very easily, but it also sets the stage for where AI can help us read third-party paper.
Hmm.
And wow, this is a good roadmap item of like, even if you don't meet that percentage, how can you make everything easier internally once we have this third-party paper and lawyers are having to pore over it? What have you seen around third-party paper and AI recently?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of third party paper. Historically, let's take a MSA or even like uh, order forms ourselves can be quite beefy. And so, what is the data that you're really trying to mine? A lot of times, from a seller perspective, they're trying to find key things. I have a client in a telco, and they have, let's say, they have an MSA and they might have 10 different products. Well, each of those products might have a different start and end time because of the installation. And so how in the world can you do that? Salesforce does have some capabilities, but AI is very snappy in terms of bringing those up for them. And then maybe there's some key language that you might want to lean into as well. We had COVID 3 years ago, and that's a perfect example, kind of a force majeure example. But how do we pivot in this new world and do our contracts even have a force majeure? I'm trying to think of the other key sellers. I mean, a lot of times they might want to look at even the initial signatory. If it spans years back, is there certain language that prohibits them, or it might be guardrails that they're not aware of, and so they want to be as educated as possible. The feedback I get when they reach out to a client, especially from an account management perspective, I think that you want to be a SME, and you mentioned the minutia that sailors don't want to get into, but what they want to do is be very informed. So I think from a third party perspective, what is them in concert with their legal or sales ops can extract the key data out of that contract to make them the thought leader and SME with their existing client or a net new client as well.
Yeah, they need to know what they're talking about, right? To be
Mhm.
a good seller, you've got to know what you're agreeing to and like every little piece of that. That's so solid. One thing about the AI in certain products, and I've been thinking about this as a practitioner, is how do we fit this into our broader ecosystem? And like Salesforce has Einstein, and there's new AI tools all the time in all of the spaces. I know DocuSign is releasing some more AI tools in
Mhm.
addition to Sites and Analyzer that
Yep.
honestly look really cool. Something that I've been dwelling on a lot is right now, AI is not perfected.
Yep.
So
Correct.
it's actually just adding steps to a process. So maybe before we just assumed the human looked at it, but now if AI does, we still need the human to look at it to make sure that it's correct.
Absolutely. Hmm.
And so it's extending the life cycle, not necessarily adding a shortcut, but maybe it's just a pivot and or a trade-off. Uh,
Hmm.
and I've been thinking about this specifically because I'm working with a client now that's global, and they've got like 10 or 15 different languages. And they asked me
Yep.
about how could CLM work with AI to translate these things safely and effectively without bringing in liability. If you were asked that question by a client, what would you say?
That's it. I like that. I mean, it's very relevant, right? Especially you give the global scenario. And so I think going back a bit to your earlier point is that in some cases, AI can lengthen the cycle. I think it really depends on the adeptness of the end user. And so to your point, I think taking a step back, there's a lot of inquiries are raising their hand about, can we sprinkle AI into the sales cycle? I was at a legal conference in New York a couple months ago, and again, largely a legal audience, but they were talking about their internal stakeholders, and it overwhelmingly was sales. And so AI and sales seemed to be the theme that I saw. And so how can we get that more expeditiously? I would say in the case of legal, let's say, when I was a seller, we had these large contracts. And again, maybe it's a net new client. There's a jurisdictional aspect you mentioned, and I'll get to that. I remember without AI or even without the aid of CLM, I was actually negotiating on with my general counsel a large Chinese company that we all know it's equivalent of a Fortune 500 today. There was different nuances or different language in there. And then I think of fast forward to now, how much more expeditious that would be, even though it was in English, there's maybe a different context or different approach. And a lot of red lines were on both sides. But from a language perspective, AI perspective, who can be trained? Who can adopt a change management? I think that's a key thing. Like, for instance, if you're a selling team, would it be the legal person, kind of pouring over that document? They would, inject AI. As you know, AI can extract key terms very quickly, but even that, who is the owner that's actually going to like validate that the AI surfaced the right things? Could there be a legal person? Could there be a, sales deal desk kind of thing? And then from a language perspective, I, my personal opinion that we should start with the world's business language is English today. So I think you should really start from that. That's kind of the low hanging fruit. In terms of the other languages, I'm not too sure, quite candidly, if we're there yet. All the different language models I've seen, at least with CLM, everyone's kind of uh, clamping onto ChatGPT, and I've seen more or less the use cases being specifically English. I think that's where we should start. Kind of perfect that, especially since the world's business language is English, and then we can go into the various other languages as well with AI. But I think we're at the beginning innings. I would say maybe if it's pregame right now for AI and CLM. I'm curious your thoughts when you fielded that question, language and then AI and CLM.
We entertained it for a while, and we even talked through how Salesforce, DocuSign, all of the
Hmm.
tools could be used in other languages. But later today, I'm going to come back with my answer, which is actually the same of let's start in English and maybe some English character languages, French and
Yep.
Spanish specifically, just to make sure that we're doing it correctly and perfectly, give AI a little more time to catch up, and then go from there. So, yeah, it's funny because we think AI can make us jump 10 feet, but really it's for right now, it's only jumping like one or two, at least in this space. But I'd rather take steady steps than build something for a business that sets them up for a bad time. So I guess it's better to take steady, strong steps in the right direction. At least that's where
Yeah.
I'm at.
Yeah. And I think that's so exciting, Nikita. Like, I love talking the future state of CLM, and what you just said is very powerful. Like, maybe the other languages that are akin, like Portuguese, Spanish, French, because they're all considered Romance languages next to English. So I think that's another low hanging fruit. But can you imagine, let's say in the future, I'm working with, maybe a giant German conglomerate, let's just say SAP, let's pick them out of a hat. I'm an English speaker, and then my counterpart is in Munich. Again, they speak English, but they're more comfortable negotiating in Germany and German. Wouldn't that be amazing? They're doing all their red lines in German, and then maybe there is some interpretation by an AI, and not only the language interpretation, but the contractual interpretation. And then you don't even need to like make sure that they're all using the world business language. That's powerful future state stuff. So I'm excited to let's put a parking lot in that, and let's monitor where that goes. 'Cause that's exciting stuff, Nikita.
Absolutely. I also, because, Neuroflash is a Salesforce shop, and I've found while
Mhm.
I've done many integrations in my life, and that works for a lot of people, there's so much in this Salesforce ecosystem for CLM. And I say that because, especially if you go through the whole life cycle of your business, and we do a lot of projects that you start with the marketing lead, and then you quote, and then you close the
Yep.
deal, then you book that order and you send a truck out, and then maybe there's customer service associated, and then there's an
Yep.
invoice, and it comes back around into the financials, and you're literally in a bit of an infinity loop. And the funny part is that contract was only the beginning of a business life cycle, and
Yep.
Salesforce kind of encapsulates that. So I guess I work at NeuraFlash, so like we obviously do everything Salesforce, but for
Yep.
you, what's it been like with seeing CLM? Like, we love CLM, but it's not a complete business tool. It's the external motion. How do you see it marrying up with something like Salesforce in your experience? And
Yeah. And I think oh, go ahead.
no, just you got it. You got it. I was jumbling my words. You got
No worries. Yeah, no, I think that Salesforce plays a critical because I think if you go back CRM, I mean, it's I forget, I think they were founded in the late 90s and then really got legs, I would say, in the mid 2000s. And they really created the modern day SaaS category as we know it, Mark Benioff and team. And so a lot of companies, if you asked them, what's the source of truth, I think is where you were going here. A lot of people today would say most likely CRM, or maybe if they're more like procurement focused manufacturing, maybe it's ERP, but let's just say it's CRM is the source of truth. So how as a seller does that matter to me? So like you mentioned, if I'm a seller, I'm managing my, opportunities within Salesforce, right? So it's usually the various stages that we're well familiar with. And that's the historical, aspect. Maybe I'm qualified the deal all the way to close one, which is the most exciting aspect. Where I think that CLM plays a huge component is that symbiotic relationship between CRM and CLM. So you mentioned lead to cash, or even like a CPQ type environment. If I'm a rep or a seller, I need to make sure that the data can very get swiftly to the client. So you mentioned like maybe a quoting tool or lead to cash or whatever the aspect might be. Let's start there. They can easily integrate it with CRM, Salesforce, get the relevant quote data, the relative product details, push it into a DocuSign product and send it over. And that's just the initial quote. And then depending on what the feedback is, that can kick off the greater life cycle that you mentioned, the negotiation, the back and forth between the client. And then I would say another thing too is, again, I hearken it back to talking to sales teams. We need to meet them where they are. And so if they're already in Salesforce, the great thing about DocuSign CLM or the greater ecosystem is you can generate a contract right then and there, as we know. And so whether it's, I mentioned quoting process or even just generating an actual contract, you initiate the sales cycle. I just go into my regular dashboard and then I can kick off the process. It can go out to the client externally. It can go internally. And as we know, there's different ways you can slice and dice it. It doesn't have to just be a generate contract button. You can also push valuable reporting from CLM into CRM, Salesforce. So, a lot of times we mentioned those success metrics. If I'm a seller, I want to very easily see where's my contract. One thing that you and I talked about before is sellers always have their one-on-one, right, with their manager. And historically, it went back to that stage cycle. As a seller, that's what I would really do with my managers. Hey, I think this one's going to close, and then I'm going to move it to the next stage. But how about we bring, as you mentioned, CLM into Salesforce and say, well, historically, I notice clients take a 90-day contract turnaround time. I can more confidently look at my reports in Salesforce from CLM, see turnaround times, dissect the data a little bit, and very confidently tell my manager, you know what, we're within that time frame of that 3 months, and I can forecast it for next quarter. Maybe it's in the pipeline this quarter, but it's I'm going to commit for next quarter. So I think kind of talking about it, I get excited when sellers want to see that CLM data in Salesforce. And conversely, I've also had sellers that say for more actionable and more insight, they would be keen to use CLM as well. But I think meet them as where they are as much as you can. And then, if they're using CRM as a source of truth, keep it as a source of truth. Maybe in the future state, we can entertain CLM as a source of truth, but let's work in present and then work towards the future progressively.
Yeah. To kind of like put a bow on what you said, what I'm hearing is at the end of the day, the most important thing is the right back. It's not just the snapshot in time of what we got. It's everything that we're sending back to the place that they work the most.
Mm-hmm.
So the status updates, and even that question about the source of truth, something that I like to tell people is CLM is the source of truth from the moment it's out the door till it comes. We don't know what they're going to say. And it's almost like your business process is running through. And the most common is going to be like Salesforce, CLM, and then your ERP, right? But sometimes that's not the journey. Sometimes it's Salesforce, CLM, back to Salesforce, or to a legal entity database somewhere else to grab data or querying something. But I've loved the leaning into what you said there of pushing the workflow data back live to Salesforce all along the way. They can be like, what used to be a black hole of, I emailed them a copy, I don't know where it's at. I know that they viewed it. I know that they viewed it X amount of times. I know that they submitted
Mhm.
the red lines. I know that all these things happened. Or internally, I know Matthew has looked at this 3 times
Yeah.
because is that, and I can like keep track of that. And that makes me feel better than if I was like, I don't know, I emailed it to Matthew. God knows when he's going to get it back to me. Right. And so, like, all of those little updates make everyone's life better, less
Mhm.
stressful. The source of truth can be consistent. Something else that I think is really important with those write backs is let your customer correct their own data.
Yep.
Well, for example, if you send a quote and they're like, you spelled my name wrong, or it's actually
Mhm.
comma and period, or,
Mhm.
all these little things, or address is wrong, instead of making the same mistake on the next contract, let them redline, absorb the red line, push that back to Salesforce, and there's
Mhm.
less friction in the buying
Yeah.
process because they
Mhm.
are like, oh, this AE is paying attention to me. They heard me. They didn't. It's just automated, but like it makes right?
Absolutely. You want to delight the customer. And I think that right back is important. And, I'm curious to see where it goes, because a lot of times you mention, that back and forth, and then it's, taking or pulling data from Salesforce. But oftentimes the overall contract, the executed one, will live in CLM. And so that's another thing too. It can be mined for data in the back end. We don't, and that's not the focus of this conversation, but that can be pushed to decision makers within the organization via BI tools. So again, Salesforce is the mechanism for that in a lot of cases. And then it's being married with CLM. And it ultimately, I don't even use repository. I say a trove of data, on the back end. And then the other thing I would say too, like just kind of double click into what you said, it's a single pane of glass. And so not only what a contract is externally, but internally, like you have all these different stakeholders. Maybe there's marketing that needs to get involved, it could be IT, it could be legal. And so even historically, then you didn't even know where it was internally, and you might have to Slack, email, this, that, the other. Versus now you can simply say, okay, it's there, and then if they're using CLM specifically, that they can actually collaborate on the document itself with comments and such.
Yeah. You've been in this ecosystem for a while and you've also worked at different CLM vendors.
Mhm.
You've been at DocuSign for a while. Can you tell me more about why you kind of aligned yourself with DocuSign as a CLM expert overall?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think one, it starts out with the platform at large. So DocuSign, we actually just celebrated our 20th anniversary. So we're almost old enough to drink and as a company. And so I think you really see that we were a category creator. And it's not oftentimes you can say that about any company. We talked a lot about Salesforce, which is the, 800-pound gorilla in terms of SaaS and will be, I think, for the ensuing years. But they created a category of CRM. We created eSign where it was marginally legal, right? I mean, what is this eSign? What's this all about? I need a piece of paper. And so we really did this I would say the shifting the mindset is that you don't need to have, a physical piece of paper. You don't need to have that attachment. You don't need the scanner and all that. Luckily, this is a legal binding contract. And not only that, we kind of made our own version. And so that being said, I was excited to see a category builder that was global. And then they're actually, they were very, it's still a phenomenal company in terms of our side. We're always iterating on that experience, but they wanted to talk about the whole life cycle that I talked about. So they did some acquisitions. They've done some organic building the product as well to create what we call the agreement cloud. And so that has components of eSign, it has components of CMM. And I really liked that when I was entertaining the thought of DocuSign. And then secondly, the other big component is, partners like NeuraFlash. We have these thought leaders that, in your case, you started with Salesforce, you have a huge name for it, and now you're making that other name with CMM, and those two marry and work together. And so we can't always be the thought leader at SMEs. And so we absolutely adore that we partner with client or partners with like NeuraFlash. They can go in there and do the selling sometimes for us, with us. And then, you already have the clients and that expertise and that relationship. And so we can come then as a SaaS vendor or vice versa. We can lead with the SaaS vendor aspect or say, you know what, we know this company NeuraFlash, they're really strong with Salesforce, meet CLM. Why don't you have a discussion with them? And I really like the outcomes that you incorporate into the sell. And then I would say the other thing is to our product partnerships as well. So, implementation partners like NeuraFlash, but then we're partners with Salesforce that we talked about. We actually co-develop a lot of things with Salesforce, not only their core platform, but Slack. And then Microsoft is coming into the fray as well. And I think that both those partners, they have a huge emphasis on AI. And so I'm curious to see where we lean into their AI, and then also, doubling down on our efforts too. So I think there's a lot of exciting announcements to come. And I also wanted to, kind of ping pong it back, what brought you to NeuraFlash? Because I know that you've been on the client side, you've also been in the partner ecosystem. What brought you to NeuraFlash?
I love CLM. That's kind of
Mm-hmm.
embarrassing. I'm like a CLM nerd, but
Mm-hmm.
the thing that brought me to NeuraFlash is a company that has their hands in the full business process. We kind of
Mm-hmm.
talked about it a little bit. To me, that was really exciting. I know that we've spent a lot of time talking about the sales cycle,
Yep.
and that happens a lot and it's really common, but getting all the way across the business is a different experience. And I've very much enjoyed, you mentioned how we do this together. NeurFlash pitches themselves as a customer advisor. And so because we're rebuilding their whole environment in all
Yep.
the aspects of their business, there's a level of trust.
Yep.
And we can advise them on, hey, this is what you're doing. This is how this will fit in. And I love doing that because I'm not pitching them. I'm
Yep.
really just saying, I know your business. I've heard the ins and outs all the way through. Our group is seeing the gaps, and this is how I recommend you close the gap.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that phrase, best in cloud, that
Yep.
I know is thrown around by a lot of people, but there is a lot of ounces of truth to right now, the way the ecosystem is looking, DocuSign is best in cloud. And so knowing that NeuraFlash versus other partners I've been at or spoken with actually was the advisor in the space for their clients, I was like, this is a perfect marriage of we can be an advisor and I'm going to always pitch the best in cloud option and let that be. And also exactly what you said of the partnerships with Microsoft and Salesforce reiterated,
Mm-hmm.
we're all kind of in this together. We want the best for these clients, and all of these tools are working together in a healthy, cohesive way to deliver the best solutions possible. And, I'm an implementation person. That's what we want. Like, we want to be able to be like, I saved you X amount of dollars each year because of XYZ. And I know that
Mm-hmm.
we can get together. So that's kind of why I've stayed and reveled a little bit in this DocuSign ecosystem. I know there are competitors. We see them, we talk about them. But for right now, this is definitely the best there is to offer. And so there's a lot of alignment there.
Absolutely. And, I think it's exciting that I think we've talked about it before in our conversations. I'm a CLM nerd too. And, we want this space to grow. Again, NeuraFlash and DocuSign can't be the only players in town. So we know that there is a greater partner ecosystem, a greater CMM, provider ecosystem. And so I think that it's folks like NeuraFlash, that revenue rescue. I mean, how incredible is that? Again, sellers and companies maybe don't want to admit that they have a revenue problem, but when you come in as a trusted advisor and have that deep relationship, you can be that thought leader. And that's going to grow the space because maybe they thought, oh, we're just going to work with our North American business unit with NeuraFlash. Oh gosh, we have LATAM, we have Europe. So that's how CLM swells. And same thing with DocuSign. We're global today. And, we have a very healthy CLM practice. It grows year over year, but why can't it be bigger? And then the greater the overall ecosystem is, we all win. I think that I saw somewhere that CRM, if you round up all the revenue from all the CRM players, because believe it or not, it's not just Salesforce, it's in the realm of $60+ billion a year. And so I'm excited to see where the category goes with CLM. I don't know if they'll ever get that large, but I think it's a good work that we do as partners and then the greater ecosystem does as well, that will all win for the category.
I saw a statistic this morning that every year, most 82% of businesses kick off 2 digital transformation projects. And if a partner can help them go through that pretty painful process,
Yep.
well, it opens a lot of doors for us, but also for them to alleviate the stress of like, how are these going to talk to each other? What is it we're going to do? What is this worth? How do we measure the value? Who is this going
Yep.
to affect? And uh, CLM is just one piece of the puzzle. It's whole modern age of moving everything digital. And yeah, it's not always Salesforce and it's not always DocuSign, but it's the same principles across the board. And this is just where you and I are sitting today.
Yeah. And I actually had a question for you because you talked about the two large digital implementations. We're talking about CRM and CLM prevalent. Where do you think it sits in the tech stack? Because it's one thing that, we're CLM nerds, you're a CRM, and I'm also a CRM nerd too, because I followed Salesforce. Where do you think we sit in, let's say, an enterprise organization, and they might have upwards of 50 different software. Some are point solutions, some are platforms like we're talking about. Where do you think we sit in the percentage?
uh, oh man. I mean, I think we're some of the biggest investments because we're guarding the money.
Yep.
Kind of like SAP would be also a giant investment,
Yep.
but this is a completely ridiculous story I'm about to share. I remember being very young in my career and I was doing implementations and I was talking to a gentleman who was doing sales and I was saying, why do you guys make so much more than we do? And he said, Nikita, you might be 10 times smarter than us, but we bring in the money. And I said, that's very rude. That's not very young. And I've thought about that. So that moment is burned in my brain. I think about this all the time of companies invest in what immediately gives them an ROI.
Yep.
And so when CLM is brought in for procurement software, because that's a spend, or when CLM
Yep.
is brought in for a legal software, which is a spend, it doesn't get as sticky. But if I can
Yep.
get in where revenue comes in the door,
Yep.
suddenly the return on the investment is light years ahead of everywhere else. It's not an
Yep.
expense, it's an investment. And so always coming back to that and then tacking on the other ones because they're like, well, you already bought it. You might as well get all this extra sweet stuff. Like, let's expand on that. It's
Yeah.
a different conversation. So I do think, I don't know exactly how to answer your question, but I think it's one of the most pivotal purchases you can make. And
Yep.
ideally owned by not just IT, but the triple threat of legal, IT, and sales. And then we'll expand from there.
Absolutely. I think that's my sentiment exactly. I had a client a couple weeks ago that said, they oversee 18 different software solutions. And so they kind of ranked CMM and CRM in that, top 5% tile because it is holistic. I mean, they're literally looking at, I always think that corners or contracts are the four corners of your organization. And so you don't have to take everything on at once. I think sales, to your point, there's a great ROI. You're empowering these sales teams, and then you not only empower them, but their counterparts internally. So legal, finance, whatever stakeholders. So that's what excites me about it too, is that it is very holistic. And CRM also very holistic. You've seen that category grow, especially with Salesforce, all the other things that you can do, the marketing cloud, service cloud, et cetera. So I'm excited to see what CLM could do, especially DocuSign. Can we also fix or have value adds like contracts, like layer things, or maybe even have like with Force.com? Could there be something equivalent to that? And again, these are just my opinions only. Could you have a Force.com equivalent for contracts where you kind of have a cottage industry that gets built on CLM? So yeah, I think we hit the nail on the head in terms of why the focus. And I think now there's a maturation of the why of CLM versus now, I think maybe a couple of years ago is more of a me too. They read a buzzword about it, but now I think there is a maturation that there is a why and it's a sustainable why.
Oh, yeah. Sustainable why, yeah. It it was a there was a wild ride in there, and at the beginning of COVID and CLM blowing up versus being a tiny legal tool to now being a business-wide tool. And
Yep.
I love your excitement about the future because there's every business needs it, and helping them get to their future state is just such a joy and a privilege. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me. It's always fun to talk CLM with you. I'm sure we'll speak again. And if you ever want to talk to us or connect or nerd out on CLM, feel free to chat with Matthew or myself on LinkedIn anytime, anywhere, and we'll be there. It's our favorite thing. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.